The first thing Letitia Wainwright noticed about the Bar M Ranch was the silence, and the second thing she noticed was that it was not the peaceful kind. The stagecoach had rattled her bones loose for 3 days out of Cheyenne, and when it finally lurched to a stop before the sprawling ranch house in the spring of 1878, she stepped down into a yard littered with broken harness leather, empty whiskey bottles, and the suspicious stares of 6 unshaven men who looked as though they had never once in their lives been told to wipe their boots. Not one of them moved to help her with her trunk. Not one of them tipped a hat. They simply watched her, the way a pack of wolves might watch a rabbit that had wandered too far from its den, curious but not yet decided on hunger. "You the new cook?" one of them finally called out, a broad man with a beard like a briar patch and tobacco juice staining the corner of his mouth. "I am Miss Letitia Wainwright," she said, drawing herself up to her full height, which admittedly was not much, but she had learned in her 26 years that posture could make up for a great many inches. "And you are tired of standing here," the man said, and spat into the dust not 2 feet from her skirt hem, then turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse without another word. It was, Letitia would later reflect, a fairly accurate introduction to the Bar M Ranch and to the territory of Wyoming in general, a place that seemed to have collectively decided that manners were a luxury better suited to parlors back east than to the hard, wind-scoured plains where cattle outnumbered people 40-1. She had come west after her father's dry goods store in Boston had failed and been swallowed by his creditors, after her mother had died of a fever the following winter, and after she had spent 2 years teaching other people's children to read while quietly starving on a schoolteacher's salary that never seemed to stretch far enough. When she had seen the advertisement in the Cheyenne newspaper, seeking a housekeeper and cook for a large cattle operation, wages generous, room and board provided, she had told herself it was simply practical. She had not expected the advertisement to have failed to mention that 4 cooks before her had quit inside of a month, nor that the ranch was known throughout 3 counties as the roughest outfit in the territory. She found that out only after she had already signed the letter accepting the position, and by then it was too late to reconsider, not that she would have anyway. Letitia Wainwright was not, whatever these men might think, a woman easily frightened off. The man who owned the ranch, she was told by the driver as he set down her trunk with more care than any of the ranch hands had shown, was named Nathan Morgan, and she would likely find him out with the herd until sundown, as he generally was. She found him instead standing in the doorway of the ranch house not 20 minutes later, arms crossed, regarding her with an expression that was not quite hostile but was certainly not welcoming. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with sun-browned skin and dark hair that badly needed cutting, and pale gray eyes that seemed to have forgotten how to soften. He wore no hat, which struck her as odd for a rancher, and there was a stillness to him, a kind of held-back weariness that reminded her uncomfortably of men she had seen returning from the war when she was a girl. "You are Mr. Morgan," she said, because someone had to say something, and it did not appear that he intended to. "I am," he said. "You are the woman from Boston." "I am the woman who answered your advertisement, yes." 4 women have answered that advertisement in the past year, he said. "None of them lasted a month. I will save you the trouble and tell you now, Miss Wainwright, that my men are not the sort you are accustomed to. They do not say please. They do not say thank you. They eat like they are afraid the food will run off if they do not hurry, and they will not thank you for cooking it, no matter how good it is. If you are looking for gratitude, you will not find it here." Letitia looked at him for a long moment, taking in the tired set of his shoulders, the way his jaw was clenched as though bracing for her to turn around and climb back into the stagecoach. "Mr. Morgan," she said, "I did not come here looking for gratitude. I came here looking for work. But I will tell you plainly that I do not intend to cook and clean for men who cannot be bothered to say thank you, and I intend to see that they learn how, whether they wish to or not." Something flickered behind his gray eyes, something that might have been surprise, or might have been the ghost of amusement, though his mouth did not move. "Good luck to you, then," he said, and turned and walked back toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard with her trunk and her resolve, which at that moment felt like the only two things she truly owned in the world. That night was the disaster she had half expected. The ranch house kitchen was a cavernous, soot-stained room with a stove large enough to feed 20 men, which was precisely how many sat down at the long pine table when she rang the supper bell. She had spent the afternoon making a stew from what she could find in the pantry, and biscuits besides, working harder than she had in months to have something decent on the table by sundown, and the moment it was set down the men descended upon it like a swarm of locusts. Elbows flew. A young man with a gap-toothed grin reached across another man's plate to grab the last biscuit, before Letitia had even finished setting down the platter. Someone knocked over a jug of water and nobody moved to clean it up. Within 10 minutes the food was gone and the men were rising from the table, pushing back their chairs with a scrape of wood on wood, and not one of them, not a single one, said a word to her beyond a grunt. "Gentlemen," she said, and her voice cut through the scraping of chairs like a rifle shot, sharp enough that several of them froze mid-motion. "I have just spent 4 hours preparing that meal. I would like, before any of you leave this table, to hear the words thank you." There was a long silence. Somewhere outside a dog barked at nothing. The bearded man who had spat near her skirt that afternoon, whose name she would later learn was Cyrus Beale, let out a short, ugly laugh. "Thank you," he said, dripping with sarcasm, "for the pleasure of your company, ma'am," and the other men laughed with him, and one by one they filed out into the darkening evening, leaving her alone with the wreckage of the table and the dying light of the stove. She did not cry, though she wanted to. She had promised herself, on the long stagecoach ride west, that she would not cry over men who did not deserve her tears, and Cyrus Beale most certainly did not deserve them. Instead, she sat down at the head of the table, the one chair Nathan Morgan had occupied and vacated without a single word to her either, and she thought about her father, who, despite losing his store and his fortune and eventually his health, had never once failed to thank her mother for a meal, had never once let a kindness pass unremarked. She thought that if her father, a broken man in a broken city, could remember his manners, then surely these men, out here under all this open sky, with all this land and all this freedom, could learn to remember theirs too. It took her 3 weeks to make the first crack in the wall. The boy's name was Jesse Cobb, and he could not have been older than 19, a lanky, sunburned young man with a nervous habit of chewing his thumbnail and a way of flinching whenever anyone raised their voice, even in laughter. She learned from the ranch's aging foreman, a leathery old cowhand named Pete Sorensen, who had at least the decency to nod at her in the mornings, that Jesse had come to the Bar M 2 years prior as an orphan of 15, his parents killed in a wagon accident on the Oregon Trail, and that Nathan Morgan had taken him on when no one else would, though Nathan had never been particularly warm about it, simply practical, the way he was about most things. Letitia began, without announcing her intentions to anyone, to leave a slice of pie on the windowsill of the bunkhouse most evenings, a small kindness that cost her little and asked for nothing in return. For the first week, the pie simply vanished, with no acknowledgement. On the 8th evening she found the plate washed clean and set neatly back on the windowsill, and beside it, scratched into the dust of the sill with what she guessed was a fingernail, 3 small words: "Thank you, Mom." She smiled for the first time in weeks and did not tell a soul, but she baked 2 pies the next day instead of 1. It was Jesse who finally spoke to her properly, a few days later, when she was struggling to carry a heavy bucket of water from the well to the kitchen and nearly lost her footing on the uneven ground. He appeared as if from nowhere, took the bucket from her hands without a word, and carried it the rest of the way himself. "Thank you, Jesse," she said, once they had reached the kitchen door, and she watched him flinch slightly at the words, as though they were unfamiliar in his ears, as though gratitude were a language he had once known and forgotten. "You are welcome, ma'am," he said, so quietly she almost missed it, and then he ducked his head and hurried away before she could say anything else. But she noticed that his ears had gone red, and she noticed, too, that at supper that evening he was the only man at the table who met her eyes and murmured his thanks when she set down his plate. It was not much. It was one boy, out of 20 men, and the rest of them still ate like wolves and left the table without a backward glance. But Letitia Wainwright had grown up watching her mother mend the same dress a dozen times over rather than admit it was beyond saving, and she understood in her bones that some things were worth the slow and patient work of repair. She began to understand Nathan Morgan a little better over the following weeks, though he remained as guarded with her as he had been on that first afternoon in the yard. She learned from Pete Sorensen, who liked to talk while he mended fences and did not seem to mind that she often brought him coffee and stayed to listen, that Nathan's father had built the Bar M from nothing after coming west following the war, and that he had died 3 years earlier when a horse threw him during a spring roundup, leaving Nathan, then only 27, to run the largest and most troubled outfit in 3 counties, mostly alone, and his brother. She asked one afternoon, because she had noticed a portrait in the front parlor of 2 young men who shared the same gray eyes, and only one of them was still living at the ranch. Pete's weathered face grew somber. "Daniel," he said, "Nathan's younger brother. Rustlers killed him 2 years back, out past the north pasture trying to run off some of our cattle. Nathan found him. He was never quite the same man after that, Miss Wainwright, if you understand my meaning. He does not let much in any more. Not since Daniel, and not since his mother passed of the same fever that took his father's spirit even before the horse took his life. Seems like sorrow just kept finding this family, one after another, until there was nothing much left of the man who used to laugh." Letitia thought of the stillness in Nathan Morgan's gray eyes, the way he held himself like a man perpetually bracing for another blow, and something in her chest ached for him, though she was careful not to examine that feeling too closely. She saw him properly for the first time, not as the distant, hardened owner of the ranch, but as a man, on an evening in early June when a sudden thunderstorm rolled down off the mountains and caught half the herd scattered across the north pasture. She had been finishing the supper dishes when the men came thundering in on their horses, soaked to the bone, shouting about a stampede that had nearly taken 2 of them off the edge of a ravine before they managed to turn the cattle. Nathan came in last, favoring his left arm, blood soaking through the sleeve of his shirt, where a length of barbed wire had torn him open trying to keep a gate from swinging loose in the wind. "It is nothing," he said, when Letitia insisted on tending to it, waving her away with his good arm even as his face had gone pale. "I have had worse." "I am certain you have," she said, already fetching hot water and clean cloth from the kitchen shelf, "but you will allow me to clean it regardless, Mr. Morgan, unless you would prefer it turned septic and cost you the arm entirely, in which case by all means continue arguing with me." He stared at her for a long moment, and then, to her surprise, something that might almost have been a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "You are a stubborn woman, Miss Wainwright." "I have been told so," she said, easing back his torn sleeve with careful hands, "by men considerably more intimidating than you, Mr. Morgan, and none of them succeeded in changing my mind either." He was quiet while she worked, sitting at the kitchen table with the rain still drumming against the windows, and she was aware of him watching her in a way he had not before, not with suspicion now but with something more like curiosity. "Why did you really come out here?" he asked finally, as she wrapped clean linen around the wound. "A woman like you, educated, you speak like you were raised for better things than scrubbing pots in a bunkhouse full of men who spit tobacco on the floor." "A woman like me," she said, tying off the bandage with more force than was strictly necessary, "was raised to believe that a good name and a full pantry would see her through life comfortably, and then watch both of those things disappear within the space of 2 years. I came out here, Mr. Morgan, because there was nothing left for me in Boston, and because I discovered that I am not the sort of woman who does well simply waiting for something to happen to her. I would rather go out and make something happen instead, even if that something is teaching 20 ungrateful cowhands the meaning of the words thank you." He studied her face for a long moment, the rain still falling outside, the lamp casting warm light across the rough wooden table between them. "My men are not ungrateful," he said quietly. "They have simply forgotten how to say so. There is a difference." "Is there?" she asked. "There is," he said, and there was something raw in his voice now, something that told her he was not only speaking of his men. "Gratitude requires you to believe that good things might keep happening. It is easier sometimes to simply stop expecting them, so that when the good things stop coming, as they always seem to eventually, you are not surprised, and it does not hurt quite so badly." Letitia sat very still, understanding suddenly that she was not merely looking at a hard, distant rancher, but at a man who had buried his father and his brother, and, in some essential way, buried a piece of himself alongside them, out of fear that loving anything too openly only invited it to be taken away. "That sounds like a lonely way to live, Mr. Morgan," she said softly. "It is," he admitted, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely, and she saw plain exhaustion and grief written across his face, before he seemed to remember himself and stood, drawing the mask back into place. "Thank you for the arm, Miss Wainwright," he said, and though the words were simple, she understood, from the way he held her gaze a heartbeat longer than necessary, that he meant them more deeply than the words alone could carry. "You are welcome, Mr. Morgan," she said, and watched him disappear into the rain-soaked night, and found, much to her own surprise, that she was smiling. Summer settled over the Bar M ranch with the slow, relentless heat of the high plains, and Letitia found herself settling too, into a rhythm of work that no longer felt entirely like a battle against 20 hostile strangers. It was not that the men had transformed overnight into gentlemen. Cyrus Beale, in particular, remained a thorn in her side, prone to muttering about how a ranch was no place for a schoolteacher's manners, and prone to leaving his boots caked with mud on her freshly scrubbed kitchen floor, as though testing how far he could push her patience. But something had shifted gradually, the way a riverbed shifts under years of water, so slowly you cannot see it happening until one day you realize the whole shape of the land has changed. Jessie Cobb had become, without either of them quite acknowledging it, something like her ally among the hands. He took to arriving early for meals to help her set the table, and he had taken it upon himself to remind the younger hands, in his quiet way, to wash up before supper and to wait until everyone was served before they began eating. When old Pete Sorensen's rheumatism grew bad in his knees, it was Jessie who carried his coffee to him rather than making the old man rise, and Letitia noticed that Pete, in turn, had begun thanking Jessie for it, a small exchange of courtesy that would have been unthinkable at that first disastrous supper. She began, too, a small tradition that she was not certain would take root, but which she felt in her bones was important. Each evening before the meal, she asked that the men bow their heads for a moment, not necessarily to pray, though some did, but simply to give thanks, aloud if they wished, silently if they preferred, for the food before them and the work of the day behind them. The first few nights, this was met with rolled eyes and audible sighs, and Cyrus Beale made a great show of refusing to bow his head at all, staring at the ceiling instead with his arms crossed. But Letitia was patient, and she was consistent, and slowly, one by one, the men began to comply, first out of simple exhaustion at her insistence, and then, gradually, because something in the ritual began to feel less like an imposition and more like a comfort, a small still point in the middle of long, hard days. It was Nathan Morgan's participation that surprised her most. He had taken, in the week since the night she tended his arm, to arriving at supper a few minutes early, ostensibly to review the ranch accounts at the kitchen table while she cooked, though she suspected it had more to do with the quiet conversations that had become a habit between them, comfortable silences broken by small exchanges about the day's work, about the weather, about the books she had brought west with her that sat in a small stack beside her narrow bed. He never missed the moment of thanks before supper, and one evening, to her genuine astonishment, he was the one who spoke into the silence, his voice low and a little rough with disuse. "I am grateful," he said, and the table fell utterly silent, 20 rough men staring at their employer as though he had sprouted a second head, "for a roof that does not leak, for cattle that are fattening well despite the dry spring, and for a kitchen that no longer serves burned beans every single night." A ripple of laughter went around the table, and Letitia felt her face grow warm, though she could not entirely suppress her smile. And Nathan added, more quietly, his gray eyes finding hers across the table, "for the patience of the woman who has spent 3 months trying to civilize the lot of us, with more success than I would have believed possible." She did not trust herself to speak, so she only nodded and busied herself with ladling out the stew, though she was aware of the warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the heat of the stove. The rival to all this fragile progress arrived, as trouble so often does, without warning, in the form of a well-dressed man on a fine black horse who rode into the yard on a hot July afternoon, while most of the hands were out mending fence along the eastern boundary. His name, Letitia would learn, was Silas Hargrove, owner of the neighboring Diamond H spread, a man with slicked hair and a smile that never reached his cold blue eyes, and he had come, he announced to Nathan Morgan with barely concealed satisfaction, to discuss the matter of the water rights along Cottonwood Creek, which ran through both properties and which the Bar M had used, unchallenged, since Nathan's father first staked his claim 15 years earlier. "There is a new survey," Hargrove said, unrolling a document with a flourish that struck Letitia, watching from the porch, as deliberately theatrical. "It appears the creek's true boundary lies further west than your father believed, Morgan, which means, unfortunately, that you have been drawing water from my land for the better part of a decade. That creek has run through Bar M land since before you ever set foot in this territory, Hargrove," Nathan said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "My father filed the claim himself." "Your father," Hargrove said with a thin smile, "filed a claim based on a survey that was, shall we say, imprecise. I have friends in the Territorial Land Office who assure me the matter will be settled in my favor within the month, unless, of course, we can arrive at some more amicable arrangement between us." His eyes flicked, briefly, toward the porch where Letitia stood, and something in his gaze made her skin crawl. "I understand you have taken on quite a capable housekeeper, Morgan. Perhaps we might discuss the matter over supper sometime, the 3 of us." "You will not set foot at my supper table, Hargrove," Nathan said, his voice gone dangerously quiet, "and if you attempt to cut off my access to that creek, you will find that this ranch, however roughly you may think of its hands, is not so easily bullied." Hargrove only smiled his cold smile, rolled up his document and rode away, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Nathan did not come early to the kitchen. Letitia found him instead in the barn, well after dark, sitting on an overturned crate with a lantern casting long shadows across his face, staring at nothing in particular. "He means to take the water," Nathan said before she could ask, as though he had known she would come looking for him. "Without that creek, we lose the herd within 2 seasons. Without the herd, we lose the ranch. Everything my father built, everything Daniel died defending, gone because a man with more money than decency wants a few more acres of grazing land." "Then we will not let him take it," Letitia said simply, and sat down on a hay bale near him. "We," he repeated, and there was something almost wondering in the way he said the word. "You have spent 3 years believing you must carry this ranch alone, Mr. Morgan," she said gently. "I have watched you do it. But you have 20 men in that bunkhouse who have learned, slowly, to say thank you to each other, to look out for one another, to actually be a crew instead of 20 strangers who happen to sleep under the same roof. That did not happen because of me alone. It happened because underneath all that roughness, there was already something worth building on. You are not alone in this fight. whether you have allowed yourself to believe it or not." Nathan looked at her for a long moment in the lantern light, and something in his gray eyes softened in a way she had not seen before, something unguarded and almost frightened, like a man standing at the edge of a cliff, and finally considering what it might feel like to fall. "My father used to say that the mark of a good ranch was not how many cattle it ran," he said quietly, "but how many men would still be standing beside you when the herd was gone and only the hard work remained. I stopped believing that after Daniel died. I stopped believing men stayed around for anything but wages." He paused, and his voice grew rougher. "You have made me start to wonder if he was right after all." "He was right," Letitia said, "and I think Nathan." And it was the first time she had used his given name aloud to his face, and she saw him notice it. "I think you are a better man than you have allowed yourself to be these past 3 years. Grief does not have to mean the end of gratitude. Sometimes it only means you have that much more to be grateful for, once you let yourself feel it again." He reached out slowly and took her hand, his calloused fingers rough against her palm, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, the lantern light flickering between them, the sound of horses shifting in their stalls the only noise in the warm summer dark. "Thank you, Letitia," he said finally, and the way he said her name, soft and unpracticed, as though he had been turning it over privately for weeks before finally allowing himself to speak it, made her heart turn over in her chest. "You are welcome, Nathan," she whispered, and for a moment in the quiet of the barn it felt as though the whole ranch was holding its breath alongside them. The weeks that followed brought the crisis to its head, and Letitia found herself, much to her own surprise, at the very center of it. Nathan had ridden into the territorial capital to contest Hargrove's survey through proper legal channels, taking Pete Sorensen with him to testify to the original boundaries his father had walked with him as a boy. And in his absence, Silas Hargrove had grown bolder. Word came from a passing drover that Hargrove had hired several rough men, not simply ranch hands, but the kind of men who drifted from territory to territory finding trouble wherever it paid, and that he intended to dam the upper reaches of Cottonwood Creek before the legal matter could even be settled, starving the Bar M's cattle of water regardless of what any survey eventually determined. It was Jesse Cobb who brought her the news, riding in hard from the eastern pasture with his horse lathered and his young face pale with alarm. "They are at the creek now, Miss Wainwright," he said. "A dozen men at least, with shovels and dynamite, and Mr. Morgan will not be back until tomorrow at the earliest." Letitia felt fear rise in her chest, sharp and immediate, but beneath it something steadier, something that had grown in her over these past months of learning this rough land and these rough men. She thought of her father, who had lost everything and still found the strength to thank her mother for a simple supper. She thought of Nathan, standing at the edge of losing everything his family had built, and of Jesse, orphaned and frightened and still, despite everything, choosing kindness. She thought that perhaps courage, like gratitude, was simply a habit one built through small daily choices, and that this was a moment that called for both. "Gather every man on this ranch," she said, "and have them meet me at the house within the quarter hour. And Jesse, ride for the sheriff in town and tell him what is happening. Tell him Nathan Morgan's water rights are being stolen, while he is away seeking justice through proper channels, and ask him to come as quickly as he is able." Within 20 minutes, 18 ranch hands stood in the yard, dusty and confused, looking to her for direction with an expression of trust that would have seemed impossible 3 months earlier. "Mr. Hargrove intends to dam Cottonwood Creek before the survey dispute is settled," she told them, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "If he succeeds, this ranch loses its herd, and every one of you loses your livelihood along with it. I do not intend to let that happen, and I do not believe any of you do either." Cyrus Beale, of all people, was the first to speak. "What do you propose we do about it, ma'am? We are cowhands, not soldiers." "We do not need soldiers," Letitia said. "We need witnesses, and we need enough hands to make it clear that this ranch will not be bullied while its owner is away seeking a lawful remedy. We ride to the creek. We do not raise a hand in violence unless violence is raised against us first, but we make it plain that 18 men and their families' livelihoods stand against whatever dozen hired troublemakers Hargrove has bought himself, and we wait for the sheriff to arrive and see the matter settled properly. There was a moment of silence, and then Cyrus Beale, to Letitia's lasting astonishment, gave a short nod. "Well," he said, "I suppose after 3 months of that woman teaching us to say please and thank you, we owe her enough respect to actually do as she asks for once." A ripple of laughter went through the men, tension breaking just slightly, and within minutes they were saddled and riding hard for Cottonwood Creek, Letitia among them on the gentlest mare in the stable, her heart hammering but her resolve steady. They arrived to find Hargrove's men already at work, shovels biting into the earth along the creek bank, a wagon loaded with dynamite crates parked ominously nearby, and Silas Hargrove himself sitting astride his black horse, overseeing the operation with evident satisfaction. His satisfaction faded considerably at the sight of 18 hands riding up in a solid line, with Letitia Wainwright at their center, her chin lifted and her spine straight despite the fear thrumming beneath her calm exterior. "Mr. Hargrove," she called out, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly on the reins, "I would ask that your men cease work immediately. This matter is currently before the Territorial Land Office, and any alteration to this creek before that matter is settled would constitute a serious crime, one which the sheriff of this county has already been informed of and is riding to investigate this very moment." Hargrove's eyes narrowed. "This does not concern you, Miss Wainwright. This is a matter between ranchers." "It concerns me," she said, "because I have spent 3 months learning that the people of this ranch, however rough they may have seemed to me when I first arrived, are decent, hard-working men who deserve better than to have their livelihood stolen out from under them by a man who cannot win his claim through honest means and so resorts to dynamite instead." A murmur went through Hargrove's hired men, several of them exchanging uneasy glances at the mention of the sheriff, clearly reconsidering whether the wages Hargrove was paying were worth the risk of a jail cell. Hargrove himself seemed to sense the shifting mood, his composure cracking slightly at the edges. "You are bluffing," he said. "No sheriff is coming." It was at that moment that the sound of hoofbeats reached them, and every head turned to see not only the county sheriff and 2 deputies riding hard along the creek road, but Nathan Morgan himself alongside them, having met the lawman on the road into town and turned back immediately upon hearing Jesse's breathless report of the danger at Cottonwood Creek. Nathan's gray eyes found Letitia first, taking in the sight of her sitting tall and unafraid among his assembled hands, standing between his ranch and its ruin, and something in his expression shifted into an emotion so raw and open that she felt her breath catch. The sheriff, a weathered man named Garrett with a badge that had clearly seen decades of service, took one look at the dynamite crates and the half-dug trenches along the creek bed and did not need much explanation. "Hargrove," he said, "you are going to want to have your men put down those shovels before I find cause to arrest the lot of you for destruction of property pending a legal dispute. The land office survey is not final, and until it is, this creek remains under joint historical use as it has been for 15 years. You so much as light 1 stick of that dynamite, and I will see you spend considerably more time in this territory than you had planned, in considerably less comfortable accommodations than you are accustomed to." Hargrove's face had gone an unpleasant shade of red, but he was not, whatever his other faults, a foolish man, and he understood when a hand had been thoroughly lost. "This is not over, Morgan," he said, wheeling his horse around. "I rather think it is, Hargrove," Nathan said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that Letitia had not heard from him before, a man who had finally remembered how to stand fully in his own strength. "The survey will show what it shows, and I trust it will show the truth, which is that my father filed his claim honestly, and that creek has always belonged to this land. But even if I am wrong about the line, I will not have you steal it out from under me with dynamite while I am occupied defending myself through the very legal channels you claim to respect. Take your men and go." Hargrove went, his hired diggers trailing after him with considerably less swagger than they had arrived with, and the sheriff lingered only long enough to confirm the details for his report before riding on, leaving the Bar M hands alone at the creek in the late afternoon sun, 18 dusty, sweat-soaked men and one woman who had, in the space of a single afternoon, proven herself to be exactly as formidable as any of them, if not more so. Cyrus Beale, of all people, was the one who broke the silence, riding his horse up beside Letitia's mare with an expression she had never seen him wear before, something like genuine respect. "Miss Wainwright," he said, "I believe I owe you an apology and a proper thank you besides. I was not kind to you when you first arrived, and I did not believe a woman from Boston had any business teaching grown men how to behave. I believe I was wrong on both counts." "Thank you, Cyrus," Letitia said, and meant it fully, feeling something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since that very first evening at the supper table 3 months earlier. "I accept your apology, and I will tell you I am glad to have been wrong about you as well. I thought you an irredeemable case for the first several weeks." Cyrus actually laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded. "I imagine I was." That night, after the herd had been checked, and the hands had eaten a hearty supper that Letitia had prepared with the help, for the first time, of 3 separate men who insisted on helping her chop vegetables and knead biscuit dough, rather than sitting idle while she worked, Nathan found her outside on the porch, watching the last light fade from the western sky in shades of orange and violet over the distant mountains. "You rode out to face down Hargrove's men without waiting for me," he said, coming to stand beside her at the porch rail, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him beside her in the cooling evening air. "I did not think there was time to wait," she said. "And besides, I told you, Nathan, you are not alone in this fight anymore. None of us were about to let Hargrove take what belongs to this ranch, not while there was breath left in us to stop him." Nathan turned to look at her fully then, and in the fading light she could see the depth of feeling in his gray eyes, no longer guarded, no longer bracing against loss, but open and unafraid in a way she had not seen since that very first evening she had come to know him. "My father used to tell Daniel and me that the measure of a person was not what they had, but who stood beside them when they had nothing left to offer in return. I have spent 3 years believing that no one would choose to stand beside me, that everyone who mattered would eventually be taken from me, one way or another, and that it was safer, easier, to expect nothing from anyone." He paused, his voice growing rough with emotion he no longer seemed inclined to hide. "You have taught this entire ranch to say thank you again, Letitia, to remember that kindness given is worth acknowledging, that gratitude is not weakness but a kind of courage. But you have taught me something more than that. You have taught me that it is possible to hope again, to believe that good things might keep coming, that loving something, loving someone, does not have to mean bracing for the moment it is taken away." "Nathan," she whispered, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it. "I love you, Letitia Wainwright," he said simply, the words coming easier than she would have believed possible for a man who had spent 3 years locking every soft feeling behind a wall of grief and duty. "I have loved you, I think, since the night you patched up my arm and told me you would not be intimidated out of doing what was right, and I have been too much of a coward these past months to say so, afraid that saying it aloud would somehow curse it, the way everything else good in my life seemed to be cursed. But I watched you today, riding out to defend this ranch and these men as though they were already your own, and I understood that I would rather risk losing you by loving you openly than lose you slowly by continuing to hide how I feel." Letitia felt tears rise, unbidden and unashamed in her eyes. "I love you too, Nathan Morgan," she said. "I have loved you for weeks, though I told myself it was foolish, that a hardened rancher and a failed shopkeeper's daughter had no business falling in love in the middle of a dispute over water rights and cattle, and 20 rowdy cowhands learning their manners. But I do not think love asks our permission before it arrives, does it? No, Nathan said, a real smile breaking across his face for what she suspected was the first time in years, transforming him entirely, softening the hard lines that grief had carved there. I do not believe it does. And then he leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished. And when she did not, he kissed her there on the porch in the last light of evening, gently at first and then with a depth of feeling that spoke of 3 years of loneliness finally finding its answer. From inside the ranch house, through the open window, came the unmistakable sound of applause and whooping, and they broke apart to find nearly every hand on the ranch crowded at the window, grinning and cheering, Jesse Cobb loudest among them, and even Cyrus Beale wearing an expression of undisguised delight. "It is about time," Pete Sorensen called out, his weathered face creased with a wide smile. "I have been watching the two of you circle each other like nervous colts for 3 months now." Letitia laughed, burying her flushed face against Nathan's shoulder, and Nathan, to everyone's evident astonishment, laughed too, a full, unguarded sound that seemed to surprise even himself. The Territorial Land Office confirmed, some weeks later, exactly what Nathan had always believed. The original survey had been accurate, and Cottonwood Creek remained rightfully part of the Bar M's boundary, with Silas Hargrove's claim dismissed entirely, and a note made in the county records regarding his attempted interference with the water rights before the matter was settled. A black mark that would follow him and considerably dampen his standing with the other ranchers of the territory for years to come. Nathan rode home from the capital with the news and with a small velvet box tucked carefully into his saddlebag. And that evening, after supper, in front of the entire assembled crew of the Bar M Ranch, he knelt on one knee beside the long pine table where 3 months earlier no one had known how to say thank you, and asked Letitia Wainwright to marry him. "I built this ranch on the belief that hard work was enough," he said, holding her hand in both of his gray eyes bright with unshed tears. "But you have taught me, and every man in this room, that hard work means little without gratitude, without kindness, without love to give it meaning. I do not want to spend one more day of my life without you beside me, Letitia. Will you marry me and make this ranch, and this ungrateful crew of cowhands you have so thoroughly reformed, your home?" "Yes," Letitia said, laughing through her tears. "Yes, Nathan Morgan, 1,000 times yes." And the ranch house erupted into cheers loud enough, Pete Sorensen swore later, to have startled every head of cattle from the north pasture clear to the Cottonwood Creek line. They were married on a golden afternoon in late September, in the yard of the Bar M Ranch, beneath an arch of wildflowers that Jesse Cobb had spent an entire morning gathering, with the whole crew turned out in their best clothes, boots polished for the first time in living memory, hats removed and held respectfully over their hearts. A circuit preacher rode 2 days out of his way to perform the ceremony, and Pete Sorensen, standing in as something like a father to Nathan in the absence of his own, walked Letitia the short distance across the yard with tears openly running down his weathered face. Cyrus Beale, unexpectedly, had spent the previous week building a small wooden hope chest as a wedding gift, carved with wildflowers to match the arch, a gesture so far removed from the man who had spat in the dust at Letitia's feet on her first day that she nearly wept at the sight of it. "Do you, Nathan Morgan, take this woman?" the preacher intoned, and Nathan's voice, when he answered, rang clear and steady and utterly without hesitation across the assembled crowd of hardened cowhands who had, in the space of a single summer, remembered how to be gentle, how to be grateful, how to be a family bound together by more than simply shared wages and hard labor. "I do," he said, "and I thank God every single day that she chose to answer that advertisement, roughest ranch in the territory or not." The years that followed were not without their hardships, as no life in that hard country ever truly was. There were dry summers and harsh winters, a bout of fever that swept through the bunkhouse and nearly took old Pete Sorensen before Letitia nursed him back to health with the same stubborn determination she had brought to every challenge since her arrival. And once, memorably, a near disaster when a late spring blizzard caught half the herd exposed on the high pasture, requiring every hand on the ranch, including a very pregnant Letitia directing operations from the ranch house with hot coffee and blankets for the returning men, to work through the night to bring the cattle safely home. But the Bar M Ranch, under Nathan and Letitia Morgan's joint stewardship, prospered as it never had before, its reputation slowly transforming across the territory from the roughest outfit in 3 counties to one where, travelers said, a man could always count on a warm meal, an honest handshake, and a crew of hands who treated one another, and any visitor who came through, with a courtesy that seemed almost old-fashioned in a land still rough around every edge. Their first child, a son they named Daniel after Nathan's lost brother, was born in the spring of 1879, delivered in the same ranch house bedroom where Nathan himself had been born 31 years earlier, with Pete Sorensen pacing the porch outside so anxiously that Cyrus Beale finally sat him down bodily in a chair and poured him a cup of coffee to calm his nerves. Their second child, a daughter they named Margaret after Letitia's own mother, arrived 2 years later, followed in time by a second son, and the ranch house that had once echoed with the crude jokes and careless manners of 20 rough strangers grew instead to echo with the laughter of children who were taught, from their very first words, to say please and thank you, to help an elder hand carry a heavy load, to bow their heads before supper not out of obligation, but out of genuine gratitude for the abundance of their lives. Jesse Cobb, the frightened orphan boy who had been the first to leave a message of thanks scratched into the dust of a windowsill, grew into a fine young foreman in his own right, eventually marrying a schoolteacher from the nearby town who had come to give lessons to the growing number of children on the Bar M and the neighboring spreads, a small irony that Letitia never tired of pointing out to him with a knowing smile. Cyrus Beale, gruff and unpolished to the end of his days, became something like an uncle to the Morgan children, forever slipping them peppermint sticks from the general store and telling them wild, exaggerated stories of the roughest ranch in the territory, before it had learned, thanks to one stubborn woman from Boston, how to say thank you again. On quiet evenings, when the work of the day was done and the children were tucked into their beds, Nathan and Letitia would often sit together on the same porch where he had first confessed his love, watching the sun set in brilliant colors over the mountains. The ranch spread out peaceful and prosperous before them, 20 families now instead of 20 lonely drifters, a community built not merely on cattle and grazing land, but on the small, daily habit of gratitude that Letitia had planted, patiently and persistently, in soil that had once seemed too hard and too rocky for anything gentle to take root. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathan asked her once, many years into their marriage, his hair beginning to show streaks of gray, his hand still finding hers as naturally as breathing whenever they sat together. Answering that advertisement, coming all this way to a ranch full of men who did not even know how to say thank you. Letitia leaned her head against his shoulder, watching their children chase fireflies in the deepening dusk, listening to the distant sound of the hands' laughter drifting from the bunkhouse, a sound so different from the sullen silence of her first night that it seemed almost to belong to another lifetime entirely. "Never," she said, and meant it with her whole heart. "Not for a single moment. I came looking for work, Nathan Morgan, and I found instead a home, a family, and a man I love more than I ever believed possible. If that is not something worth being grateful for, I do not know what is." He kissed the top of her head gently, and they sat together in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge over the Wyoming plains, 2 people who had taught each other, and an entire rough ranch besides. That gratitude was not a weakness but a strength. That love, once risked, was worth every fear it demanded be overcome, and that even the hardest, roughest corners of the world could learn, given enough patience and enough kindness, to say thank you again.